Hello and welcome to today's WorkSafe Month webinar, Respect at Work, Understanding Gendered Violence as a Work Health and Safety Issue. I'm Stephanie Morawski from WorkSafe Tasmania and I will be your moderator. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. I'll now go over housekeeping. Here is a screenshot of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this in the upper right corner of your screen. You're likely listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Webcams and audience microphones will not be used in today's webinar. Questions will be taken at the end of today's presentation. Please use the questions pane on your control panel to type and submit your questions. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to welcome today's presenters. Jessica Munday, Secretary, Unions Tasmania. Pia Severi, Co-Lead, Women's and Equality Team, Victorian Trades Hall Council. Sophie Ismail, ACTU Legal and Industrial Team, Gender Equity Officer, and Alina Thomas, CEO in Gender Equality. Our first speaker is Jessica Munday, Secretary, Unions Tasmania. Jessica is the leader of the trade union movement in Tasmania. Elected as Secretary of Unions Tasmania in 2017, her organisation represents approximately 50,000 workers across the private and public sector. Jessica is an experienced industrial relations and work health and safety practitioner. Before leading Unions Tasmania, she worked with the Community and Public Sector Union for 12 years, including 3 years as the Regional Secretary of the branch. She is also a Trustee Director of Industry Superannuation Fund, TasPlan, a WorkCover Tasmania Board Director, and President and Treasurer of the Community Legal Centre Worker Assist, which assists injured workers navigate the Tasmanian Workers' Compensation System. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and hello to everyone that's listening in today. Thanks for that intro, Steph. For those of you that are tuning in, if you don't know much about Unions Tasmania, as Steph said, we are the peak body for workers, and we're also a health and safety representative training provider. So we're very passionate about safety at work. Before I begin, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional and original owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Palawa people, to pay my respects to those that have passed before us and acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal community who are the continuing custodians of the land. This webinar is going to discuss a difficult issue around gendered violence, but I am actually going to leave a bit of a warning and some avenues for support to Alina, who is very well versed on giving you that sort of information. We're really pleased, and I'm only going to be speaking for a minute or two. We're pleased to host this webinar today. Australia's got a problem with family and domestic violence. We know that, but we also know that it doesn't just happen at home. It follows mostly women, unfortunately, to work. But dealing with family and domestic violence as it relates to the workplace is by no means the only way that gendered violence manifests itself at work. So from jokes about sexual orientation or weight or appearance to sexual harassment and outright assault, it can actually appear in lots of different ways. We've got a sexual harassment problem at work in this country that was confirmed by the Australian Human Rights Commission in their recent survey. But if you're a purveyor of any of the media, you will see often reported cases of sexual harassment in the media. Many of us can't forget, I certainly don't, that there was a shocking independent investigation into Dyson Hayden, the former Chief Justice of the High Court, which found that he had harassed a number of women during his time in that role. And so, if sexual harassment of that sort of degree can exist in the highest court in the land, imagine what it's like in some workplaces for young or powerless workers. So while many people often view gendered violence as potentially an industrial issue, it is obviously a work health and safety issue. A PCBU has that primary duty of care to make sure that the workplace is healthy and safe. Gender violence can be a workplace hazard, posing risks to your team of both a physical and psychological nature, and failing to address them may mean that there is a failure in that primary duty of care by PCBUs. So we could probably talk about this issue for many hours, but we've got one, and we've gathered together a group of what I hope will be really educational and knowledgeable speakers for you. So I'm going to hand over to them shortly, but we do have some polls, some questions to get you thinking about how your workplace responds to gendered violence. Steph, I'm not sure if they're going to appear for people to see, but some of the questions that we're asking is whether your workplace, to think about whether your workplace has a policy on gendered violence, if staff have been consulted about that policy, and whether or not your workplace has an elected health and safety representative. So I'll leave those with you to.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll launch the first poll. Does your workplace have a work health and safety policy on gendered violence? So we'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll, Jessica, and I'll share the results.
Wow, I don't know if that surprises people. It probably doesn't surprise me. It's actually good that I think that 44% do have a policy, but obviously clearly shows the majority don't. And I wonder if it's a policy. Lots of workplaces in our experience have a policy on, say, family and domestic violence, but they maybe not have taken that the next step to, be a policy on gendered violence per se. So it's worth checking into. All right, what about the next question, Steph, around whether staff were consulted about that?
Thank you. So the next question is, have staff in your workplace been consulted about a work health and safety policy on gendered violence? We'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll and share the results.
Yeah, interesting. I think the value of a policy that hasn't been consulted with staff makes you question, think about how many people are aware of the policy and how effective it will be if it hasn't been consulted with staff. Obviously, under our Work Health and Safety Act, it's built on principles of consultation and cooperation. So it's worth thinking about whether that policy is real to the people in your workplace. All right, thanks, Steph. And the last question, does your workplace have an elected health and safety rep?
We'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll and share the results.
Excellent. Excellent. And we asked this question because health and safety reps have a particular role in our safety system, but also too, they're likely to be first point of contact for workers in many instances when raising any health and safety issues in the workplace. That's excellent. All right, I'm going to move along to our first speaker now. I'm going to introduce first up Alina Thomas, who many of you will know because she has been a high-profile advocate for on domestic violence, and social and political inclusion and gender inequality in our state. Elena is the CEO of Gender Equality, and they are a Tasmanian-based family violence service. And Elena has a reputation really as a progressive change agent, someone committed to developing community-driven solutions to inequality. And I'll invite you to start your presentation, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me here as too. It's always I'm always so excited to be able to have this conversation. And so today I'm going to be talking about a little bit about how the experience of family violence and violence against women, gender-based violence, how that becomes sort of manifested through cultural practices that we see as sort of everyday sexisms really in our workplaces. And I would always start a talk like this with this kind of information around where to go if you're experiencing any abuse or violence, if you're being affected by abuse or violence. And I just draw your attention to 1-800-RESPECT, which I think is a pretty well-known brand these days. But what people often don't know about 1-800-RESPECT is that while they are a service for people who are experiencing violence and abuse, they're also able to offer help, professional help. So if there's something that's going on in your workplace and you're unclear of what to do, you can ring them and get some tips and some support about creating change and supporting people better as a bystander and as an active bystander. I've also put in Gender Equality's phone number up there because I really, I guess there are a couple of reasons. One is to encourage people to give out our number for victim survivors and people who are needing support around violence and abuse, but also because if something comes up and you want to continue the conversation with me, I would be absolutely delighted to talk to you, and you're very welcome to call me and ask a question or continue that conversation. So yeah, they're those numbers there. Now, when we're talking about violence and abuse, it is a difficult conversation to have, and it's very easy for it to sort of stay off the agenda, so to speak. And I think that, joining forums like this one, it's really important that we continue to feel really invigorated about the work that we're doing and continue to feel supported about it, because we can feel very isolated in this work. We can feel like we're the only ones. We end up getting, typically when we're operating in this space, there's backlash and there's resistance, and those things can be very, very hurtful, and they can also really put you off wanting to speak out. But so I really reiterate that it's really important that we continue to have this conversation, not only so we can be supporting the health and well-being of employees, but because we want to be modelling ways of working. We want to be able to actually embody, this and a practice of non-violence and a practice of anti-oppression, so that we're not contributing to the systemic factors that are enabling violence to be occurring in the first place. And in doing that, we can break cycles, and we can also support people who are being targeted by abusive people to come forward, share their stories, get support. And that's also a mechanism to bring the spotlight onto the people who are using abusive behaviour, so that they become there's accountability there, and so that that issue can be addressed. And I think we're very fortunate that this is part of something that really is happening across Australia. We're in a very much a different stage of responding to violence and gender-based violence than we have been 10 years ago, and it's that we do have opportunities to be drawing on that expertise from some national bodies, and as just mentioned, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, there's a lot of research and some great reports there. I'm going to be referring to one called We Set the Tone, which came out of their Males Champions for Change program, which is specifically around everyday sexism in the workplace. I also would like to draw your attention to Our Watch and the work that they do with the national framework to prevent violence against women and children, which is called Change the Story. For people who aren't familiar with Change the Story, it very cleverly draws a bridge between violence against women. So the violence that we see reported in the media, the violence that ends up in courts, that drives homelessness and those sorts of issues, and how that is driven by particular behaviours that tolerate and condone violence against women. And I can talk about those a lot. I just would like to really quickly mention that they're condoning of violence against women. So this idea that it's kind of excusable for men to use violence in certain circumstances, and we certainly do have a tolerance around that. There's men's control of decision making, which in turn leads to limits to women's independence and women's control of decision making, and we can see many examples of that happen in public life, in the workplace, and also in relationships. There's rigid gender roles and stereotyped ideas of masculinity and femininity, and again, there's so many examples of where that culture idea of male and female masculinity and femininity really restrict our expression, our identity, and control our behaviour. And also male peer relations that emphasise aggression. So we've got the condoning of violence, but we've also got that promotion of violence that we see quite strongly in Australian culture. So, and I just wanted to, I wanted to also share this slide because it's just really important that we do come back to a gendered understanding of violence, and I want to be inclusive and also responsive of these facts at the same time, and it's always an interesting exercise for us to do when we're moving into this space, to be holding all genders in our consideration of violence prevention, also recognising that there is a gendered experience and that women are more likely to experience violence from men, from somebody that they know, their current or former partner, and in a private place. And when I was thinking about that, when I relate those facts into the workplace and relating that back to the experience of male violence, is that again that idea where when women work with men and where women know the men well that they work with, and then the opportunities for there to be private places, so to speak, at work, that work is really can often be an extension of that power imbalance that many women experience at home or domestically, is also replicated in workplaces, and that just in the blue cell down the bottom, that women's experiences of intimate partner violence are more serious. They higher risk of serious injury and lethality, and the ongoing impacts are much greater than men's experience of violence as well. Excuse me. So when we're breaking that down into workplace experiences, I wanted to draw your attention to what that might feel like and what some of those examples are. And I've got a half a dozen here that I'm going to share with you. So insults masquerading as jokes, and that's sort of, that's such already part of a big part of Australian culture, isn't it? That idea of like well, I was only joking, or can't you take a joke? And even when after the sexist joke's been delivered, if it hasn't been received properly, then there's another opportunity for a slight put down or a slight mocking or something, just to be able to continue that imbalance of power in relationship dynamics. We see it, it's a really common form of everyday sexism. It's experienced by men and women. It consists of sexist remarks, jokes, insulting terms when they're based on gender. And I think that's really interesting as a way of coming back to and checking in on the language that we're using and the concepts that we're talking about. If we are actually wanting to, be critical of someone or something, does our criticism need to be gendered? Because when we think about criticisms and the criticisms that we have in our language, they often are very gendered. And that can be a starting point of beginning to unpack some of the bias that we carry around that. Devaluing women's views or voices. Many women experience men interrupting them or talking over them, men explaining things to them as if they've had no prior skills or knowledge, and also that experience of their views not being listened to. The roles and stereotyping. That we talk about that a lot with the primary prevention framework and change the story. The assumptions that are made about the suitability for roles and the tasks based on gender, which can be, which is that idea that men make great leaders, and women are great and are caring, and again, when we start to unpack that and look at what's behind it, we can see that there is so much disadvantage towards women that gets built into an assumed role like that, and so much advantage or privilege that gets built into men's roles. The preoccupation with physical appearance, these comments about body shape, the body shaming, body size, physical characteristics, dress over skill, even the pitch of women's voices can be brought up as being a reason to discredit women's opinions, women's stances, women's authority on certain matters, because their voice isn't quite the right pitch or the pitch that I'm used to listening to. And this can be really amplified for women with public profile or in the media, and also people who are, when women are standing up against sexist practices in the workplace, this is going to be a tactic that's used to discredit her. Assumptions that careers and caring roles and careers don't mix, and that they can be relegated to the binary genders. That men and women encountered very different gender assumptions about parenting role, and women being subjected to comments that infer poor parenting or prioritising work over family, questions about their commitment to work because they work flexibly, expected to explain why they don't have children or how they're going to manage children and their career. And at the same time, men can be discouraged or denied from flexible work, or men who are, paternity leave and men's caring roles are not taken as seriously, or men might feel vilified or exposed in some way if they are wanting to take on those roles. I'm just going to, this is going to be my last slide, but I just wanted to also put in there about victim blaming and about condoning and tolerating violence, because victim blaming it comes in so many forms, and we can really, again, really unpack a lot of cultural assumptions that support. It's victim blaming, and the victim blaming happens regardless of gender, as our culture sides with a dominant aggressor. But within victim blaming, there's women blaming and there's mother blaming, and we can end up expecting so much responsibility for the ills of the world, for things that are going wrong on women. And it might be, and I think that happens, I can notice that happening on macro level, like youth of today, it's the mothers who've parented them wrong, but also on very micro levels around when things don't go well at work. There is often there's a tendency to look at looking for someone to blame. And the other thing is that when we're thinking about those gendered experiences, women are often encultured to sort of take responsibility for things in a different way. I wanted to, I am actually going to just about finish up, but I wanted to, in terms of these these everyday sexisms and these notions that have been identified in the Champions for Change report, there is also a set of things that we can do. And I think that, you know, it's being very active, it's being proactive, it's responding, it's about modelling the way that we want the workplace to be. It's about sharing power. So we challenge power and then we use it differently in the way that we operate. And then we can we create a culture where we can call that out and create different ways of enacting and playing out power. But I'll finish up there and let someone else have a go. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks very much, Elena. And just remember that we'll hold questions until the end. I'd now like to introduce you to Sophie Ismail. Sophie is with the Australian Council of Trade Unions in their legal and industrial team as a gender equity officer, but has a very long history working as a lawyer in the public sector and for unions. And Sophie's also the Australian Council of Trade Unions representative to Safe Work Australia's board. So I'm going to pass the floor over to you, Soph.
Thanks very much, Jess, and thanks to WorkSafe Tasmania for organising this really important webinar on a really topical and difficult issue. You know, it's a rapidly evolving space. I'm sorry I ran out of time to do slides, but I'm happy to send some notes around afterwards if that would be helpful, if that's possible. But what I really wanted to do today is just quickly outline some key international and national legal developments that you should be aware of. So starting with international, the key development to report in this space is the adoption of a new international law on violence and harassment at work and a supporting recommendation. So a convention is a binding legal document and a recommendation is exactly that. It's a set of recommendations, but combined, they're a very important international legal development which recognise for the first time every worker's fundamental right to be free from all forms of violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. So that was a really significant development. It's surprising that that kind of right didn't exist at international law before, but it didn't. The International Labour Organisation, for those of you who don't know, is the United Nations body for work, and it sets international labour standards for countries to sign up to. And Australia was a founding member of the ILO. We've been quite an active member of the ILO historically, and our domestic workplace laws have historically been quite heavily influenced by ILO standards, for example, in relation to termination of employment, minimum wages, equal pay, parental and family leave, just to name a few. So it is a really significant development. And of course, Section 3A of the Fair Work Act says that one of the objects of the Act is to provide a workplace relations framework that takes into account Australia's international labour obligations. So this was a topic, and for those of you who don't know, also the ILO is a tripartite body, which means that workers, employers, and governments are all represented, which can make decision making difficult at times. You need a 2/3 majority to get anything done, but it also means that when a decision is made, it's got a high level of legitimacy because you've got 2/3 of that diverse group agreeing to it. So the worker reps in the ILO have been pushing for a new international standard on this issue for some time, and it made it onto the agenda in 2014. And then subsequently, of course, Me Too and other like movements around the world really raised the profile of the issue and highlighted the need for very urgent action. And then in 2016, a meeting of experts at the International Labour Organisation found that, again, that was a tripartite meeting, found that international labour standards had a gap in them in that they didn't define violence and harassment, they didn't provide guidance on how to address it, they didn't cover all workers, and lacked an integrated approach that they said was essential to addressing violence and harassment at work. And so in response to that gap, after 2 years of negotiations, which I was lucky enough to participate in for the ACTU, a new convention was adopted by an overwhelming majority of the members of the ILO, including the Australian government and the Australian employers. And that was in June 2019. So what's in the new standard? It is a very significant and long overdue development, really, I think, because it's the first time that OH&S, industrial law and anti-discrimination law obligations have been combined together into one framework, one comprehensive framework, and that really has been, you know, we've really been crying out for that to happen, because employers are looking at 3 different regimes to try to understand what to do here, and understandably there has been, you know, some confusion. So the instruments, if they're ratified, will place clear obligations on governments and employers to address violence and harassment at work as a workplace health and safety issue, and really recognising the need to move away from reliance on a reactive, individualistic complaints process towards a more systematic risk management preventative approach. So what's in the actual convention? Importantly, it provides a clear definition of violence and harassment, and it also provides a separate definition of gender-based violence. So violence and harassment is defined as a range or spectrum of unacceptable behaviours or threats which cause or are likely to cause harm. Gender-based violence is then defined as a subset of violence and harassment, and is defined to include specifically sexual harassment. So having those clear definitions at international law is very important and very useful for employers and employees alike. And then importantly, the instruments set out detailed obligations in relation to addressing violence and harassment at work. And I just wanted to call out one of the obligations in particular. So Article 9 of the Convention requires a state that signs up to the Convention to adopt laws and regulations that require employers, and I'm going to read from the Convention, to take appropriate steps commensurate with their degree of control to prevent violence and harassment in the world of work, including gender-based violence and harassment, and in particular, so far as reasonably practicable, to develop and implement a workplace policy on violence and harassment, identify hazards and assess the risks of violence and harassment, and take measures to prevent and control them, take into account violence and harassment and associated psychosocial risks in the management of occupational safety and health, and provide workers and others with relevant information and training. So you can see there it's a really classic workplace health and safety framework that's been applied to violence and harassment. And then the recommendation goes on to clarify that the workplace risk assessment should take into account factors that increase the likelihood of violence and harassment happening at work, including psychosocial hazards and risks. And particular attention should be paid to hazards and risks that arise from working conditions and arrangements, work organisation and human resource management. That involve third parties such as clients, customers, service providers, users, patients and members of the public, because we know that that is a big portion of violence and harassment, particularly in service sectors like hospitality, you know, healthcare, education, where it's third party violence that is being dealt with. And importantly, the third aspect is that the risk assessment has to take into account risks that arise from discrimination, from abuse of power relations, and gender, cultural and social norms that support violence and harassment. So that really is a significant bringing in to the WHS framework of equality and discrimination norms that have long been separated. And we've seen this in workplaces as a big problem, where you've got discrimination and sexual harassment in one set of laws, and you've got OH&S separate in another corner, and this document really brings them together in a very useful way. Other important aspects of the convention is that it covers all workers regardless of contractual status. So you can be an independent contractor, you can be a labour hire worker, it doesn't matter, you are covered. It also covers job seekers and employees whose employment has been terminated, so very wide scope. And it covers violence and harassment that occurs in the course of, linked with or arising out of work. Again, quite a broad scope, which includes commutes to and from work and work-related technology. But of course, those obligations on employers are qualified by the fact that employers must do what is reasonably practicable. So if it's not reasonably practicable, then there's not an obligation. And there was a lot of discussion in the negotiations about what is the extent of an employer's responsibility when it comes to violence and harassment. So the current status of this document is that it has been tabled in the Australian Parliament, which is required by Australia's membership of the ILO, And the Department of Employment, the Commonwealth Department, is currently undertaking what's called a law and practice assessment, which looks at our level of compliance with the documents. And that's because Australia's general practice is not to sign up to new international laws until we're already compliant, and all of the states and territories are already compliant, which obviously can make things more complicated. And the process, of course, has been somewhat delayed due to COVID-19. But that process is underway. We are confident that the Australian government will ratify this treaty at some point. Obviously, we think it's an urgent priority and that it provides very useful guidance, and it should be ratified sooner rather than later. But this is certainly coming down the line, and it's something that workplaces need to grapple with. We think that whilst Australia would probably be largely compliant already, there are some improvements, some significant improvements to our domestic framework that we would need. And that's a good segue for me to just talk briefly about a couple of domestic law reform developments that you should be aware of. The first is in 2018, there was an independent review of Australia's model workplace health and safety laws. And for those of you who don't know, the model laws were developed in 2009, 2010, following an independent review process. And to date, the model laws have been implemented by every jurisdiction except for Victoria and WA. But they have very similar laws in those jurisdictions, and WA has gone through a law reform process that has brought their laws very much into line with the model laws. So our OH&S system, as all of you would know, is a three-tier system. There's the broad general duties in the Act, supported by detailed regs, and then codes containing practical examples. And of course, there are due diligence obligations on officers to comply with duties, with personal liability applicable for breaches. So this review basically found, the overall finding was that, look, the laws are working effectively, but improvements are needed. And there were 34 recommendations in total, with 2 highly relevant to this particular topic that we're discussing today. One was that there should be a new workplace health and safety regulation on psychosocial hazards, including violence and harassment. And the second was that the incident notification provisions in the Act should be reviewed to make sure that they provide a trigger to notify psychological injuries to the regulator. And the rationale there was that psychological health was one of the key issues raised, and there is no specific guidance. There is guidance material on managing psychological health and safety, but there is no model regulation. There is no code focused on psychosocial risks such as violence and harassment. And this finding was supported by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's Kate Jenkins' Respect at Work report, which was a groundbreaking world first report released in 2020 following the national survey, which found that 1 in 3 people experienced sexual harassment at work, and that number was bigger than previously. There were 55 recommendations in that report, and a number of which are relevant. One, recommendation 15, was to ratify the new ILO convention that I've just mentioned. There were recommendations to improve the complaints process in our workplace laws for sexual harassment, including giving the Fair Work Commission the power to make stop sexual harassment orders. Recommendation 35 backs up the Boland recommendation to have a new OH&S regulation on this topic. And recommendation 36 recommends training and education for Safe Work Australia and for regulators around the country on the drivers of violence and harassment, sexual harassment in particular. So it's clear that there's a consensus forming internationally that tackling violence and harassment must be a proactive and preventative approach rather than an individualistic approach. And these 2 reports are very clearly recommending, the same kinds of legal changes to our framework to address those issues. So you can see that there's plenty of movement and development in this space. So this webinar from Unions Tas is very timely and very important, and from WorkSafe Tasmania. And this is a discussion happening in all the regulators around the country, and Australian workplaces, regulators, unions, workers, managers and leaders are going to have to get up to speed. And we know that a number of countries already have mandatory legal obligations in relation to violence and harassment. And so this is something that is quickly coming down the line, and we need to make sure we're on board and prepared. So thanks again for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sophie. I'm going to now hand over to our final speaker, Pia Chaveri, whose background is actually in social work and has worked both in our country and the United Kingdom with children, with youth and with women in the Victorian prison system. But Pia is currently the co-lead of the Women's and Equality team at the Victorian Trades Hall Council, which is Unions Tasmania's counterpart over in Victoria. And they've done a great deal of work around gendered violence at work with their regulators. So without much more introduction, I'm going to hand straight to you, Pia.
Thanks, Jess. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that's in Melbourne, Victoria. So I'm very happy to be here, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging here, and also am very pleased to be able to speak to you all. And luckily we have the technology that I can do this in these times. Okay, so as I think Alina had already indicated, this topic can be quite challenging or confronting at times. So I've just got some referral numbers up there for you and resources, web addresses, etc., that you can check out if needed. So we've got 1-800-RESPECT through to WorkSafe in Tasmania, and obviously your union, the EAP, and CASA, the Centre Against Sexual Assault, if you need it. Okay, so gendered violence is this is our working definition that we use with We Are Union Women in Victoria. Gendered violence is any behaviour, action, system or structure that causes physical, sexual, psychological or economic harm to a worker because of their sex, gender, sexual orientation, or because they do not adhere to dominant gender stereotypes or socially prescribed gender roles. So that means violence that is experienced by women because they're women, violence experienced by lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer people because of who they are, or violence experienced by people who don't conform to the society's gender stereotypes around what it is to be male or female, or how we're expected to act along that binary. And also witnessing gendered violence that's directed at someone else. So that's as a co-worker who might be sitting in the same space or working in the same space as somebody else who's experiencing gendered violence, we would say that person is also harmed and injured in that moment. So some of the examples, and this is not exhaustive by any means, would be stalking, intimidation, systems of work that exclude workers. So that might be meetings that are held at times that make it really difficult for working mothers to attend, for example, or ways of working that make it really unsafe for certain groups because of the areas of work they'd have to enter into, or the way they would have to work. Verbal abuse, rude gestures, offensive language and imagery, obviously physical assaults, including sexual assault and rape. We also include sexual harassment as part of gendered violence. So we consider that sexual harassment can occur in an environment in which gendered violence is rampant. So where there's nothing being put in place to set a different tone and different expectation. Put downs, innuendo and insinuations, ostracism and exclusion, and also being undermined in your work or position. So obviously some of this relates to bullying or can relate to bullying, but we would say that there's times and places when it occurs and it's specific to gender. It's not just sort of straight up bullying. So Alina made some of the points about that, which was that having to, get a male colleague to put up ideas, or being told, if you're having another baby, you're not going to be serious about your job, or you're not going to be able to continue your career. So that kind of thing that we would then consider has that gendered element that creates that issue there. So it's obviously about how it makes that person feel. It's about them feeling uncomfortable, unsafe, threatened, inferior, feeling excluded, humiliated, any of that kind of reaction that they might have, and all of that can lead to injury and harm being caused. So the history of gendered violence in Victoria, the campaign that we ran through the Victorian Trades Hall Council, started many years ago now. The team was set up in 2015 and was actually well resourced and funded through Victorian WorkSafe, with a specific goal to advance the rights of working women in the safety and rights of working women in Victoria. And so we developed what's called a raw chat, Women's Rights at Work chats, which was an interactive survey that we would conduct face-to-face. That was done with hundreds of women across the whole state. And from that, what came through very strongly was this notion of gendered violence. So gendered violence as a concept had been around for the previous decade, but people were not calling it that necessarily when they described what happened to them at work. And what we found was that the majority of women that we had interviewed in that process had identified experiences and issues that had arisen in the workplace that when we assessed it, we determined it to be gendered violence. And this then formed the basis of a campaign that we ran. The first step was bringing unions on side. So we worked with our 40 affiliated unions to get that agreement that it was an issue and something we wanted to do something about. Then we brought WorkSafe into the discussion, and WorkSafe unions and employer representatives have now come with us over these last 3 or 4 years to really accept gendered violence as a workplace issue. And we're now in that place of really starting to try to look at all the different strategies we can apply to actually eradicate it in the workplace, prevent it, but also respond adequately on the occasions that it does occur. So one of those things that we've managed to achieve is a work-related gendered violence and sexual harassment guide that WorkSafe, Victoria WorkSafe, has now endorsed and finalised, and that was done by writing it in collaboration with our team and WorkSafe. And it also will come with a one-day HSR refresher on gendered violence at work. So that is also being written by our team at the moment and should be finished by the end of the year and will be rolled out by next year. So WorkSafe Victoria has supported that work and is going to ratify that training so that HSRs will be able to get time off to come and do it. The other thing that we did develop that's not strictly an OHS approach is also a gendered violence clause that has been getting into some of our EBAs in Victoria, which is very exciting as well. So there's another way that the work is being addressed in the workplace. So this is what the the guidance looks like on the website, and that is certainly something we'd encourage you to go and have a look at after this. It's comprehensive and it's all accessible and available there on their website. The key issues that we see with this particular this topic is that it's an OHS issue. It definitely causes injury. It's similar to bullying in some ways, but it also has the elements in it that means that it's manifested a different way due to that gender inequity, and it also therefore requires different interventions. And also there are systems and structures in a workplace that contribute to it that need to be challenged and changed in order to ensure that people are safe at work. And we definitely believe it can be prevented. So I just wanted to take you through a couple of case studies very quickly because I don't have heaps of time, obviously. But this is just to let you know that with WorkSafe Victoria, we're working on developing a series of case studies because, as I'm sure you know, as HSRs, the hierarchy of controls works really well with with physical risk and physical hazards, but it's harder to do or apply it with psychosocial issues. So we're working on creating a suite of case studies, all based on real life examples, in which we hope HSRs will be able to look at those and kind of pull from that what they can use in similar scenarios they're dealing with in their workplaces. So this is a case study of Lena, who's a nurse educator at a community health centre, and she works with a doctor, or numerous doctors, but one in particular, Jeremy Smith, and one of her jobs is to follow up with patients after their appointments and ensure that they understand the diagnosis they've received, the treatment options, and future appointment requirements that they're going to need. Frequently, Dr. Smith forgets to give Lena the right information about her patients, so she's unable to fulfil her duties, but she's also unable to meet the needs of the patient group as well. It's really bothered her for a long time, so she finally decided to raise the issue, but she was very nervous about doing it. When she finally did, he didn't really look at her. He just continued with what he was doing, and he also gave issued a line from a movie. I don't actually know the film, but it's a Jack Nicholson film in which he made a quote, and the quote includes things like, I don't have to listen to you, I'm going to bash your brains in. It was quite explicit and violent. And as soon as he said it, Lena felt really sick to the stomach, really frightened, really unsure of what she should do next, and also didn't want to speak anymore to him about what was going on, and immediately left the room and kind of dropped it. So we have talked through ways that we could apply the hierarchy of controls to this. So obviously at the top, we want to eliminate this kind of behaviour. So we have identified that in a workplace where there are numerous staff employed from numerous different backgrounds, professions, industries, we actually want to get rid of that hierarchy that might exist in a workplace and reduce the effect of the power over that different people in that workplace have. If we looked at substitution, we'd want to look at a work system that means that Lena and Dr. Smith don't have direct contact with each other anymore. In terms of engineering controls, it actually doesn't say in what you can see on the screen, but Lena was also a casually employed worker, whereas Dr. Smith was employed permanently in the workplace. So we also want to make sure that the recruitment processes are such that all staff have equal access to all the policies, procedures, any other workplace rights like an EBA, etc., and that they're able to access that in an equitable way. Administrative controls would include developing policies and systems, putting in policies and procedures, ensuring that we're providing the right information to all employees during their induction period, during any training, during day-to-day team meetings, etc. Employing people on a permanent basis to eradicate that inequity between people, ensuring that all employees are trained specifically in the elimination of sexual harassment and gendered violence, and of course offering an EAP. So this is one way that we have looked at this example. I'll give you another case study, which, hang on, sorry, I'm just trying to get it across. No, sorry, Sandy. So we've got Sandy who works in a supermarket, and her car is always parked at the end of the dark edge of a car park where all the staff have to park, and that's so that customers can obviously come and park closer to the shopping centre. But Sandy's work often, or her shift often finishes very late. She has to walk across the dark car park, and usually she'll be on her own, or there's not many people around. And actually it's not explained in this, what you can see, but she was harassed once when she walked across the car park by someone who was lurking around there. So she often starts feeling really worried and scared before she even finishes her shift. She gets distracted, really impacts her work, and she also injured herself once with a box cutter whilst at work because she was too busy thinking about having to walk across the car park. So again, we looked at applying the hierarchy to this in terms of an intervention, and looked at trying to do things like eliminating the issue, allowing staff to park their cars close to the store or bring them in at a certain point, substitution, offering taxi vouchers and allowing staff to get those taxis from straight outside the store, engineering controls, having security to escort staff to their cars or staff to walk in groups. Again, with administrative, looking at training, induction, ensuring all those systems are readily accessible. And PPE could be providing personal duress alarms, but obviously not the ideal approach. So you can see that we've tried to come at two quite different examples with some different strategies. And as I say, these will be resources that will be available as of next year when WorkSafe Victoria and the BTHC have agreed on the different case studies that we have, and we've got about 10 that will show you quite different sort of scenarios that can then be addressed through that hierarchy, and at least just give some ideas on how to deal with an issue that is often seen as too hard or too nebulous, even though we would argue it's not, but we know that historically it's just something that has often been seen as a problem between two people who don't get along, or a problem between just one person who's got the issue, i.e. the victim survivor, or the problem of the perpetrator, and also could be seen as a criminal behaviour, so therefore nothing to do with the workplace. So we're trying to ensure that actually we can create some really material or concrete ways that HSRs can identify options for dealing with this issue. And I'm sure you'll have many great ideas yourselves, being experienced HSRs as well. So these are the websites that I'd recommend you go and have a look at. There's ours at the top, that is Union Women, but the Safe and Respectful Workplaces website is also our website that we manage. It has a whole lot of resources on it, including the definition of gendered violence, the EBA clause I mentioned, links to the WorkSafe gendered violence guidance, and also you can see directly there is a link to that as well. So that is the complete presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pia, and thank you to Sophie and Elena. I know you could have all spoken for a really long time about this topic, and you know, our speakers have tried to cram as much in as they could. We are happy for anyone that's listened today to contact us at Unions Tasmania to put us in touch with any of the speakers or share any of the resources. Stephanie, I'm going to throw to you in the off chance that we may just sneak a question or two in there.
Absolutely, thank you, Jessica. So if anyone has any questions for today's speakers, please use your questions pane on your control panel to type and submit your questions. So one question that has come in: do you need a separate gendered violence policy, or can it be integrated into a work health and safety policy?
Shall I answer that one? Or is that directed to me? Pia? Yep. Cool. We would say yes, and the reason we would say yes is that we think because it's an issue that's not been really dealt with effectively in the workplace, we think that it needs to still stand alone and be, and we had this conversation with WorkSafe and the stakeholder groups at length, and it did go on for quite a long time till we landed on this, that we really did feel that that it was more effective to separate it out, make very clear that we're talking about this as a specific issue because it is linked so strongly to gender inequity in the broad society. So we don't want to lose sight of that, and then there might be a time, or hopefully will be a time in the future, that it could be so-called mainstreamed and brought into another policy and addressed that way. But our belief is that it will be more effectively dealt with if we keep it separate, and therefore also treat it with separate treatments or specific treatments relating to gender inequity, rather than just letting it become part of a sort of more mainstream intervention.
Thank you. Another question: we have an anti-discrimination policy which covers areas mentioned. Is that sufficient?
Sorry,
you,
go. No, go, Sophie.
Look, my comment on that would be probably not, in light of the shift, you know, the recognition that it's got to be addressed as an OH&S issue as well, and there's got to be a risk management approach, and discrimination policies generally tend to focus on complaints and a retrospective solution, whereas the requirement now is clearly to take a proactive risk management approach, as Pia outlined, and implement controls before the incidents happen. So I think I would look at updating that policy and making sure that it ties in the discrimination aspects within an OH&S framework. I don't know if you want to add to that, Pia.
Yeah, I was just going to add, like, I agree with everything Sophie just said, but I would also add that our view is that with a discrimination approach as well, it becomes quite individualised, or can become individualised between the two parties involved if we're talking about a perpetrator enacting gendered violence against an individual. Whereas with an OHS approach, we're talking about workplace culture and improving the workplace for everybody, because we're identifying a hazard that could actually be a problem to anybody. Whereas if we look at it through the discrimination lens, it's possible that we're just going to end up looking at those two people as having a problem, and then we just deal with those two people, but we still leave the space or the vacuum to be filled yet again with the next set of people that come through, or the next perpetrator that comes through and targets somebody else, for example. So we think, at least with an OHS framework being applied, we're looking at the workplace as a whole, and we're looking at the systems and structures that have allowed for that behaviour to occur.
All right, thank you. A question has come in regards to work health and safety training. Will work health and safety reps have to complete a 5-day initial HSR course before being able to participate in the 1-day refresher?
As I understand it, oh, sorry, was that someone else talking?
You go, Pia.
Okay, as I understand it, the HSRs can attend the 1-day refresher. They can opt into that, but I am talking about Victoria, so I'm not sure actually in relation to Tasmania. So they can make that choice to do it, and they would do that after they've done their 5 days.
It's Jess here. I was just going to say they need to have completed the introductory training to be able to exercise all of their powers. So we would recommend that HSRs do the 5 days to get the comprehensive training that they need to exercise all of their functions before the 1-dayer. If there was different training providers might have a different view, but certainly to give that basis of knowledge, and then to also make sure that you've had the training that enables you as a HSR to exercise those powers and functions that you've got.
Thank you, Jessica. No further questions have come in at this point. So before we do wrap up, Jessica, would you like to say some words in closing?
I just would like to thank everyone who made the time to come today, and I hope that you found the information useful as much as it's been a light touch in an hour. I hope it's been thought-provoking for you. I certainly think that, you know, Elena's comments around our gender roles in society and you know, this being a broad cultural problem are really relevant, and the things Sophie talked about, you know, demonstrate to us that we are moving at a global level to recognise gendered violence needs better solutions. I would encourage people here to really look at those resources that Pia has pointed us to. We certainly look to them quite a lot here at Unions Tasmania, because they're very advanced and have had great success in working with their regulator and stakeholder groups to get this issue on the agenda and to put some structure around it, so that you know, we're not dealing with it in ways that are ineffective in still so many ways. So I would just say, please take what you've learned here and take it back to your workplace to cast a critical eye over how well you think your workplace addresses the issue of gendered violence, and where there is an opportunity for improvement. And please, you know, seek the assistance of Unions Tasmania, your union, your health and safety representative and others to develop a safer workplace where you are.
Thank you, Jessica. So thank you to our presenters today, Jessica Munday, Secretary, Unions Tasmania, Pia Severi, Co-Lead Women's and Equality Team, Victorian Trades Hall Council, Sophie Ismail, ACTU Legal and Industrial Team, Gender Equity Officer, and Alina Thomas, CEO in Gender Equality. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Respect at Work, Understanding Gendered Violence as a Work Health and Safety Issue. Once you do leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We do appreciate you providing us with your feedback. Today's webinar has also been recorded and will be made available on the WorkSafe Tasmania YouTube page. On behalf of WorkSafe Tasmania and the WorkCover Tasmania Board, thank you for joining us.